second annual Life Raft Debate. My name is Bianca Hand, and I'm the current editor-in-chief of the Woostonian. It's my pleasure to serve as tonight's moderator for the event. Before we get started, I would like to say a few thanks to Danny Ha and the C3 program, the staff of the Woostonian, and the professors involved for their support in putting the program together tonight. Yes. We're also trying something new this year with the debate. It will be recorded and it will be put up on the Woostonian.com. The Woostonian actually does a lot more than just the Life Raft Debate each year. And if you would like to get involved with anything else with the website, contact Rachel and Tiffany. They'll be outside after the debate. So let's get started. The premise of tonight's debate is simple yet powerful. An apocalyptic event has just destroyed all of civilization as we know it. As we speak, floodwaters are overtaking much of the surrounding areas, and we have only an hour to prepare. There is a life raft big enough to hold everyone in the audience right now, with one extra spot for a professor. By the end of the night, you will vote for that professor, and the 6 debaters you see in front of you now will fight for not only their survival, but for the survival of their discipline. It will be the job of one of these debaters to convince you that you would in fact be better off to go off it alone, and rely solely on your collective knowledge and experience. It's my pleasure to introduce these 6 professors. We have Professor Friedman from Religious Studies, Professor Mariola, oh yes, right. We have Professor Mariola from the Environmental Science Department. We have Professor Prosciutti from the Art History Department. We have Professor Cardulius for the Archaeology Department. We have Professor Pollock for the Geology Department. And we have Professor Moladina, who's in the Economics Department, but he's tonight's devil's advocate. So. We will start with opening speeches. Each debater will have 5 minutes to make his or her first pitch for inclusion on the Life Raft. Following that, they will take your questions before wrapping up with final arguments and a vote. Thank you all for coming, and we will start the debate with Professor Friedman.
All right, here's the deal. Vote for me, and all your sins will be forgiven. Seriously, that is exactly why you need religious studies, so you don't fall for people who tell you that. Okay? All human beings have some need to explain the world, to make sense of their lives, to ask what's truly important. Why am I here? What's it all about, Alfie? Religion, as far as we know, is a universal human phenomenon, and it comes in many shapes and sizes. It is not one size fits all. Okay. We really need to understand how this central element of human existence functions in society. Understanding religion requires us to have an understanding of psychology, sociology, history, anthropology, and probably a few other disciplines as well. And if there were room in the Life Raft, you know, for an iPad with enough religious studies texts on it, I could probably cover most of the people here. Okay? Religious studies would give you access to a superb collection of humankind's greatest documents, right? Sources of timeless wisdom from a variety of times and places. Okay. But Here's the key point. And remember, right, you don't want to fall for the people who say, vote for me and all your sins will be forgiven, okay? You have to understand religion as a phenomenon in order not to be taken in by it, all right? My alter ego is saying, what do you mean, taken in? Excuse me, Rabbi Friedman, be quiet. Every religious tradition gives you what it claims are answers. Every religious tradition has powerful ways to motivate its adherents to do things, to act in the world, to believe certain things. We know, open up the newspaper on any given day, or since most of you probably don't read a newspaper, open up the internet on any given day, and look at all the damaging and destructive things religion is doing in our world. You can also, probably not as often, unfortunately, because of course good news doesn't get printed, you can also find stories on all the wonderful things it's doing in this world. How do you know the difference between the good guys and the bad guys in religion? When you study religion as a discipline, you learn to have a more critical and sophisticated view of it. Okay? You learn to stand outside yourself, your own commitments. And from that, you gain insight, renewed insight, into how religion functions in society, how it can be used for good, and how it can be damaging. So don't vote for the people who are going to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, forgive all your sins, get you into heaven, make you beautiful and tall and rich and wealthy and whatever, okay? Vote for the discipline that will give you the key to understanding virtually everything else.
Well, that's all well and good, but you still have to eat. So I want to imagine you're on this life raft, right? And you're on a life raft and civilization has just fallen down behind you and you're heading off into a strange, unknown environment, right? A new environment, an environment that's unfamiliar to you, perhaps a dark environment. Who then do you need with you to help you survive this new environment? Perhaps someone that studies the environment. You know, for you kids today, and for us adults too, life's pretty easy, right? Think about your life here at Wooster. Think about the basics of life. What do you need in life? Water. You need water, right? How do you get water? It's that easy, right? Well, that's an illusion. How do you get food? Food's another basic. Right. How do you get food? Walk into Lowry. All you can eat. How do you get shelter? There's another basic. Walk into your dorm. It's heated. It's cooled. It has a roof. You don't have to work for anything. Life's pretty easy. But in the lifeboat, when civilization has fallen behind you and you're heading off into the dark unknown, all that changes. You're back to the basics again. So what you have to ask yourself is, who can help us navigate this world where the most critical thing is surviving? getting the basics. So what I'm going to do for you is we're going to play a little game of process of elimination, okay? And because the devil's advocate is an economist, I'm going to keep this short and simple. And you thought you'd only get applause once tonight. All right. So let's start with water, right? Who can help us find water? Who knows where water is? Maybe a hydrologist, maybe a geologist, or maybe environmental studies, right? That's good. Environmental studies, people study water, where water is. Who can help us get that water clean? Maybe it's been contaminated by animals or that dying civilization. Who gets water clean? Chemists, environmental studies. Ah, what do these have in common? All right, let's think about food. Who's going to help you grow food in this new environment? Who understands soils, rainfall patterns, seeds? Well, agronomists, certainly. Biologists, soil scientists, environmental studies. In fact, the environmental studies program has a garden on campus. What about shelter? How are you going to build shelter in this new environment? What do you need to know to build good shelter? You need to know where the sun is, where the wind blows, what materials you can use, what materials degrade, what materials withstand the elements. So who's going to help you with this? Maybe a materials engineer, a physicist, architect, environmental studies. So to me, it's simple. Which discipline can help you through every single hurdle you're going to face on the life raft and as you encounter your new environment? The answer is clear. I don't even have to say it.
All right, so I'll admit there are some good points there, but we're going to go in a slightly different direction. I will say, first of all, that art history gets a lot of knocks, so I think we're scrappy art historians. We're used to defending the relevance of our discipline, so bring it on. The first question, what is art history? And I ask that because I think it's one of the more misunderstood disciplines. We're not artists. I'm not an artist. If you want me on the boat because of my painting skills, that's a bad choice. We're not critics. We don't decide what's beautiful or ugly or anything like that. We're historians. We're historians of visual culture. We're interested in looking at the world around us, what humans have created critically, and understanding what makes us human. So why is that important? Why should you have me on the boat? Because one thing that hasn't come up in what Professor Mariola just laid out for you is, are we worth saving? Why? Just to survive? Just to repropagate the species? Is that all we are? Because if that's all we are, I think we do have to ask, and I'm lucky there's no philosophy professors up here. I think we do have to ask, are we worth saving? And I would say yes. And one of the reasons I think we are worth saving is because of what makes us human. And what makes us human? What differentiates us from all the other species on Earth is our impulse to create, to understand the world around us through visual expression. It's as old as humanity. And what we do as art historians, that's our job. Wherever humans have lived on this Earth, from prehistoric times to the present day, and they've left something for us, that's what we study. So we study what makes us human. And if you put us on the boat, you'll have that with you. You'll have a memory of what makes you human, what makes you different from all the other animals. And believe me, that's something important to remember. So that's the first thing. There are a couple of other advantages. Similar to what Professor Friedman was saying, you get a lot of bang for your buck with an art historian. One spot on the boat, you get a lot of other disciplines. History. As I said, we're historians of visual culture. We study the entire globe, from prehistory to the present day. Religion. We study all of the world's religion. As anyone who's been in any of my classes can attest, we study a lot of religious art, a lot of religious architecture. We have to understand those religions in order to study them. That includes the big world religions. It includes polytheistic cultures from the classical times. We study everything. We bring that on the boat, that kind of institutional memory of what we've done, what we've created. Those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. So it's important that we're there to tell you what has worked and hasn't worked. We understand the rise and fall of empires, civilizations that have succeeded, what has brought them down. As historians, we can do that. We bring that onto the boat. We also draw from, very strongly, a number of other disciplines: anthropology, sociology, sometimes chemistry, physics. We pull from women and gender studies, literature, classics, theater. Art history is one of the most interdisciplinary disciplines, and in order to do our job well, we have to pull from all of that. And so if you put me on the boat, you get all of that as well. What else? We study architecture. I teach architecture. I know what kind of buildings stand up, what kind of buildings fall down. I know how to make concrete, or at least the components of it. I know how materials that work, materials that don't work, the fact that if you have a wood roof on your church, it's gonna burn down. These are important things to know. Short-term value, long-term value. You get both with an art historian. You also have an awareness, an institutional memory that keeps that boat filled with hope about what humanity can create, about what it can do if it works together. And it's important, if this is our boat, it's not the most diverse boat in terms of reflecting all of the world's peoples. Art historians, because we study all of the world's peoples, can help to reinforce the importance of the diversity that we've lost. Finally, I'll just say, as a push for art history as a discipline, we will make art again. We will create again. Even though it's going to look bleak for a while, this will be important again, and visual images will be used to influence and manipulate you, and you need to read them critically. I'm also pretty good on a boat, raised children of sailors. Thank you.
I think my colleagues have started a very nice conversation, but there's one thing that's been missing right from the outset. Nobody's asked the question, what caused the disaster? Why are we in this mess? Why do we have to make this particular decision? And there's one discipline that can address all of the different concerns that have been presented so far. Now, I've been set up as an archaeologist, but in reality, my degree is in anthropology. I come at things as an anthropologist, and archaeology is only one of the tools that anthropologists use in order to understand the world. So, what is it about anthropology that contributes to this better understanding of where we are and where we can go and how we can fix things? Well, anthropologists do a lot of the different things that my colleagues have suggested. We do it comprehensively. We look at people both as cultural entities and also as biological creatures. We need to understand how those things work together, how they're fully and totally integrated in our lives. In order to do that, we study cultural anthropology. We study the social behaviors of people. We understand how kinship works, how it organizes systems, how political systems are structured, not just in the contemporary world, but considering where we're going to be in a post-apocalyptic morass. We need to figure out, how did original peoples actually structure themselves? How did they make collective decisions? Human beings have done these kinds of things for a very long time. Anthropologists have studied a wide range of different cultures, from very complex systems like our own, all the way down to very simplistic, if you will, cultures that don't have complex political structures and governments. And we see certain common elements in that. There is an underlying commonality to all human structure. It's the way that people think about what they do. People initially have to be, and in many ways, fundamentally have to be pragmatic in their solutions about things. Religion is a critically important element. It has pragmatic components, and we need to see how those things work together. Physical anthropology is an element that is very important to understanding how the world works as well. We need to understand who we are physically, how we're related to one another, how diseases spread. Humans understand, some basic things about that, but we also need to look at the way that societies are structured has governed that in many different ways. Anthropologists study languages, and language is a critical element of communication. We're talking about a lifeboat in which there are a certain number of individuals. Are there other lifeboats out there? Are we going to encounter people with different communication systems? How do we relate to them? How do we communicate with them? Do we learn the International Phonetic Alphabet and then try to use that as a mechanism for communicating in a common fashion? That's critically important to understand. We need to understand the relationship between language and culture in that way. And then finally, certainly not least, I want to get to my own subdiscipline of archaeology. What is it that archaeologists can contribute to this particular problem that we're facing? Well, as I said, talking about what caused the disaster. This is one of the things that archaeologists have done and continue to do. We look at both the rise and the collapse of different types of governmental systems. We look at that in a long-term process. Our art historian colleague certainly has taken us back at least to the beginnings of civilization and maybe a little bit earlier than that. I submit that archaeologists can take us even further back. We can go back to the origins of humanity some 4.5 million years ago. We can even go back and study the development of the first primates and see how they adapted to a wide range of different kinds of conditions in various locations. That's critically important to know, because we know from our archaeological examinations that there were certain very important successes that people engaged in, and they also made some critical mistakes. We can learn from those kinds of mistakes. On a more practical level, when you get out of the lifeboat, you need to do a variety of different kinds of things. As Professor Mariola suggested, you need to be able to find food. Well, do you know where to look for those kinds of things? Archaeologists study those in very, very specific fashion. They look at the landscape. They understand the layout of the landscape in various ways. Do you know where you are? Archaeologists can take bearings. They can identify locations on maps. You want to make tools? What do you have to make tools with? If you want to make stone tools, you better talk to an archaeologist. If you want to understand how to manufacture pottery in its earliest forms, talk to an archaeologist. If you want to learn how to make basic shelters, talk to an archaeologist, because we do these kinds of things on a continuous basis. So I will leave you with that, and hopefully we'll have a positive vote here. Thanks.
Good evening. The rabbi began the discussion this evening by talking about a universal human phenomenon. That theme has come up a lot, and I would argue that a most fundamental universal human experience is that we all live on the planet Earth, and nobody knows Earth like a geologist. So, the geologist is the practical choice in this scenario. 3 reasons. 1, we know extinction like nobody else. We've seen species die, we've seen species not die, and we know how to avoid that in some circumstances. Plus, if it really is the end, then we could tell you how to best preserve yourself as fossils for future generations to study this apocalyptic event. Thank you. The second reason is that we are very resourceful. Dr. Mariola's list was conveniently incomplete in terms of all the things that we need from the earth. So arable soils for farming, yes, we can find those. And clean water, we can find you that too. But how about energy? You interested in having energy when you get out of the life raft? Well, we can find your coal, we can find your gas, we can find your oil. And if you're not interested in fossil fuels, we can find your hydropower, geothermal power, places to put your windmills, places to put your solar panels. We're also good at ocean currents too, so if you're floating around on the life raft and you want to know where you're going to end up, we can tell you that. We're good at finding places that are safe from hazards, avoiding volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, you name it. We can find you a safe place to be. You want clay to make your pottery and stone to make your tools? We can find that too. We can find lots of things for you. The third reason that geology is your practical choice is that the apocalyptic life raft scenario is basically a geology senior IS. Yes, every summer we take our students out to the field. We're dropped off in the middle of nowhere, and we survive for weeks, maybe even longer, out in the wilderness, completely free from civilization, and we haven't lost a single student yet. So if you need to be out in the field, you need to survive, it's a pretty good idea to have a geologist with you. The archaeologists ask, what causes disasters? Geologists teach a course called natural hazards, and we think about those things quite a bit. So archaeologists argue that they can take us back 4.5 million years into our past to understand our future. Our record is just a little bit longer, 4.6 billion years. But in the end, the idea is that the apocalyptic life raft scenario is much like what we do commonly in geology. We know extinction, we know where things are on Earth, we can get them for you, we can find them for you, and we are survivors. Plus, I do have some oceanographic experience. My research focuses on mid-ocean ridges, so I've spent a great deal of time at sea, and as recently as the sophomore retreat, I was paddling in a canoe. So I would be very happy to help you all paddle. Thank you.
Good evening. I have the job of the devil's advocate, and I bring bad news. It's the end of the world as you know it. Do you feel fine? The most important thing you need, if it's the end of the world right now, is security. Okay? You don't need a person, you need a big gun. Probably like this big. There's going to be a lot of desperate people around, and you're going to need someone to, protect you from these desperate people, or something that will protect you from these desperate people. Okay? And no discipline here is going to actually be able to help you, when some desperate person tries to go for your iPad, for example. It's the end of the world, and really what you need is people that do things, not people that sit around all day thinking about doing things. There's a famous saying, I think it's from a Shaw novel. What did he say? There are those that can do and those that can't teach. So those are very wise words from an author, a person that actually did stuff, right? I'm going to get philosophical. It's very hard for me to do that. But what's the purpose of an academic discipline, a major? Might I add that there's majors here, and then there's one minor, the environmental studies. It's a minor. So what's the purpose of an academic discipline? Simple. It's the perpetuation of an ideology. All my colleagues will tell you this is a way of thinking. This is an economic way of thinking. This is the religious way of thinking, religious studies or whatever, or environmental studies. This is how we think. So if you think about sort of a way of thinking, okay, and the fact that it's the end of the world, why haven't these ways of thinking that we already have figured out a way to stop the bloody end of the world? Why would you save space for some kind of antiquated notion that probably brought about the end of the world in the first place? You know, you might as well save room for a tiger or something like that. All right? So saving a spot for the ideologies that failed, even if they can tell you why they failed, they weren't in the forefront trying to stop those civilizations from falling. Do you see a geologist sort of saying there, stop natural hazards? You don't see that happening. You know, when people go out killing in the name of religions, do you see a religious studies professor saying, you know, strapping themselves and saying, stop, don't kill yourself? That doesn't happen, okay? So really, you do not want to save the spot for a failed ideology, okay? Save the spot for something that works, like a gun. Okay? The US education system is in shambles, and these people are, you know, the perpetuators of US education. Let me give you some data, because, you know, I do that. The PISA report, which is, you know, the PISA, that's an unfortunate name. But anyways, the PISA report, which is the most authoritative report on national rankings of reading, math, and science, gives US an average score of 500 out of 1,000. You do not want any US academics on this boat. Okay? And you might say, oh, well, you know, that's reading, math, science, it's high school, and so on and so forth. But what's the US rankings of universities? And where does Wooster figure in the top 10? Think about that.
So we're going to open the floor for the Q&A session. So if anybody has a question, raise your hand, and we'll bring the mic over to you.
This is a question for the economics professor. Wouldn't bringing a professor along actually be helpful, since even if you decide they cannot contribute knowledge, there's still a possible food source? And also, wouldn't swords be preferable to guns, since, well, guns can malfunction and run out of ammo? Swords, unless they are damaged in some way, have mostly unlimited use?
On the question of if a professor is a good food source, we're kind of old and musty. So I think a tiger is actually more entertaining.
This question really isn't pointed at anybody, but you've all established yourself as academics and at times technical experts in your field. But how do you actually plan on going about organizing us on the boat? Do you see it more as like a benevolent dictatorship where you rule by diktat? Or are we going to have a democracy? Are we going to be able to, you know, vote for ourselves and decide what we want to do? Just want to know what anybody has to say about that.
Well, I would just like to say that as an art historian, I could tell you from the background of history what has worked, what hasn't worked, democracies. We can talk about the components of, you know, Athenian democracy. We can talk about the US democracy. We can talk about the French Revolution. We can talk about all different kinds of systems of government. And then I would say that the people on the boat can make that decision.
I'll respond to that as well. I'll just point out that environmental studies fundamentally is about collaboration. It can't be about anything else. You will never, in the history of environmental studies and in the history of environmental thinkers, find anyone who says, this is what people ought to do because I say so. It's the only way we're going to solve the problems before us, which could be big problems like climate change or little problems like how do we get to the island in our lifeboat, is by working together. That's what they've always said. That's what they always will say.
I would like to say that religious studies would offer you also, a treasury of the world's ethical behavior. Okay, what you don't want in the lifeboat is Lord of the Flies. Okay? Okay. So, and I think religious studies would also have access to the wisdom to know when is it a time for democracy and let's debate, and when is it a time for, holy crap, I'm going to organize this right now because otherwise we're all going to drown. So listen to me, and we can talk about it later.
Could I just add one more thing? If we do, as is probably inevitable, end up with a dictatorship, benevolent or otherwise, art historians are really good at providing tips for developing a good imperial ideology. We got visual suggestions, we can do all of that. We're there.
So everyone spoke about how they'll help outside the raft. Now, how will you actually help people on the raft, given that you may actually not reach a land and you may be stuck on the raft for a really, really long time? So how are you going to find food and even like good drinking water? It's directed to anyone.
Okay. See, if you actually, if you vote for me, you get a twofer. Because, if worst comes to worst and you don't make it, I can bury you, or at least bury you at sea and do a really nice funeral. Okay. But seriously, okay? Because of what we study, we have, again, we can at least give you the sort of the moral hope and the be able to talk to you about it's okay. We will give you, we'll be able to talk to you, be able to give you hope, endurance, okay, fortitude, patience. All of those things are part of the materials that we study and we have on the tip of our tongues, and besides which I'll make you all I'll sing to you.
I'd like to take that on as well. One of the things that we learned from the study of prehistory is that people at various times have made massive expeditions, navigational expeditions over vast distances. This is everything from the Polynesians who made it all the way out to Easter Island, which is an extremely remote area, but it also includes the movement from the land masses of North Africa, the Near East, and Europe out to various islands in the Mediterranean. And those islands were never populated very heavily until you had agriculture. In order to do that, there had to be a real plan involved, and that meant that you had to have a full inventory of all the not just the people, but what kinds of resources you're going to take with you. And you have to plan a lot better, for example, than the English did when they went to Jamestown. You have to know that you need to get by a number of different seasons. You have to know what is going to be a reproducible kind of economy that you can develop and so on. That kind of planning is absolutely critical. And knowing that you have to take care of those things before you take off is really important, because you don't want to get out in the middle of the ocean someplace and realize, oops, we have like 1 day worth of food left and we've got 2 weeks to get to landfall. Not a good situation.
The geologist.
No, I don't think so.
No? Okay.
Yeah.
The geologist understands the thermodynamics of the water cycle. So we'd be very helpful in trying to figure out how to get drinking water. And we understand currents, water currents, and topography of the seafloor and the coastlines. And so of all of our disciplines, we'll probably be the ones to help you find land the fastest. Plus, we have a lot of good geology jokes. And so rather than singing, yeah, there'd be a lot of laughter probably. It'd be a fun life raft.
Okay, so we covered the basics of, food, water, and shelter. But what about medical sort of expertise? So we're clearly in some sort of natural disaster. There are probably injured people either around or potentially on our life raft. We all appear to be healthy, but you never know. So how would your department handle that?
Well, anthropologists have been trained in many cases within physical anthropology with a clear understanding of disease vectors and disease situations. They also know a great deal about a variety of different natural pharmacopoeia, a number of different types of materials. A lot of the drugs that we use today are actually based on natural formulations, from a variety of different kinds of sources. So those kinds of things are critically important. Knowing, for example, which herbs and so on might be able to cure particular kinds of conditions. There is kind of a natural aspirin that one can obtain from certain tree barks and so on. There are a lot of those kinds of things that can be collected and taken obviously on board and then be utilized afterwards once you get to a particular location. And also, knowing the places to avoid, when you first get into areas, knowing about conditions under which malaria, persists and where other kinds of diseases, might be more prevalent.
The only thing is, though, the anthropologists know that about what people have done in the past. Environmental studies people know all the same things, except they know what to do with present resources, because what they concern themselves with fundamentally is what can we make of what we have now, as opposed to what did people make of what they had then. So what we're expert at is looking at what are the resources that are here now. How can we make a tourniquet out of this particular material? How can we find some kind of a pain reliever out of the botanical materials we have in front of us? That's primarily what we concern ourselves with, because we take it for granted that we live in a world of scarcity, which is the hyper case on this life raft.
I'm really surprised to hear Matt, as a former anthropology major, make that statement. Considering that cultural anthropologists and archaeologists who do ethnoarchaeology study contemporary societies that use these exact same materials, and then what we do then is create models about how that was done in the past.
For my IS, as a College of Wooster student, I studied Seinfeld. As an anthropology major, how's that going to help you?
All right, so let's assume that one of you guys gets on the boat, and that you're kind of seen as sort of like the general leader, dictatorial or otherwise. Will you somehow calculate that? Let's say we have like 100 students on the boat, but we only have food enough for 50 people, like realistically. What would you do in that situation?
I would willingly starve myself.
This is when you need a gun.
No. This is when you need some serious moral guidance.
I would distribute the rock hammers.
There is such a thing as half rations, and you'd be surprised how far people can go with minimal amount of food for long periods of time. And as far as the gun, I think Professor Moladina has been watching too much Walking Dead.
So I've heard a lot about the long-term prospects for planting crops or finding shelter, but what about the more immediate concern of finding land? Who among you has the most practical knowledge for navigation at sea or fishing or filtrating water?
As a discipline? Well, I will say that in art history as a discipline, I'm not sure how much navigational work we do, but as anyone in my Global Cities class can attest to, we spend a lot of time looking at maps.
Like I said before, they think about things, but they don't do anything.
Let me add to that, that one of the things that anthropologists have studied in many cases, been able to figure out are as I mentioned, navigational skills of individuals. We talk about the Polynesians being able to find their ways across the vast expanses of the Pacific by reading ocean currents. And you realize, a variety of different kinds of things. One is able to observe various things in the environment that tells you when you are close to land, what direction certain kinds of things are going to be happening and so on. So it's something that certainly is within human capacity, and these are the kinds of things that anthropologists have studied very extensively.
As Dr. Moladina keeps pointing out, the doing part is really important, and I've actually been to Easter Island and back on a ship. I wasn't driving it, but I'm pretty sure I can get us there and back.
I just want to say I grew up on the coast, and I did a lot of sailing.
I just want to say, try navigating the College of Wooster bureaucracy when you're only a minor.
Okay, so this question is for everyone except for Professor Friedman, because I just feel like you already know how to answer this, so I want to hear from the more, yeah. Okay, so I feel like we're talking about, all these idealistic scenarios and learning and figuring things out, but how are you guys going to get people to cooperate in order to carry out all of these ideas?
Well, I'll say it again, art history is a very interdisciplinary discipline, and we spend a lot of time collaborating with and cooperating with, sometimes team teaching classes with other disciplines, so we learn pretty well how to work together. And also, I think it's really important to look at history. I think history actually tells us quite a bit about what works and what doesn't work when humans get together. There's a lot to learn there, and if you don't put someone who has a good sense of history on that boat, you'll lose it.
If you want to talk about collaborative endeavors, try going on an archaeological expedition with between 30 and 70 people. Believe me, you will figure out, how to get along with one another very quickly. No.
I'd like to point out a couple of things about collaboration that's really important. So environmental studies is a interdisciplinary kind of thing, and I kind of like that. It's very kind of nice. But there's still a fundamental problem with this very collaborative discipline. They can't seem to agree on stuff. Okay, and so much so that 42% of Americans don't believe in climate change. So what is that? Why is it that these people that collaborate and get along with each other, they have this great club where they talk about stuff in their environmental mumbo jumbo or whatever, they can't convince just regular old Americans that climate change is happening. So
ask the anthropologist.
Oh, wait a minute. I want to defend Professor Mariola here because I'm the one who can explain why it is that so many people don't believe his discipline.
That's true. It's religion, and that's actually furthers my point. Think about all the violence in the world, okay? There's actually a study that I pulled up the other day, and it showed that religiosity and violence are highly correlated. The fundamental problem that we seem to be not getting here is the problem with any kind of post-apocalyptic sort of situation is the more people you add, the more problems you're going to have. Why add another person? A gun or a tiger?
I guess my question kind of is along that road. We've talked a lot about collaboration, but let's say we found land, we've established some sort of stability. What if we came upon another group of people that were hostile towards us? How would your discipline help us kind of deal with hostile or violent situation?
Well, a common cause of misunderstanding between cultures is inability to communicate verbally. So a very effective way to communicate in a way that more cultures can understand is through visual representation. So I would say art history.
Well, the geologist can help you find important things to trade, like gold and...
Okay. How long do I have? A minute. Okay. Well, I just want to reiterate my points that I made earlier on. You know, the first point is that really, you know, when you are in a post-apocalyptic situation, the world around you is fairly complex. Yes, you may need someone to decipher the world around you, but sort of when you add that person, I would argue the marginal benefit is lower than the marginal cost. There's a lot of costs to adding these people. You know, they come with their preconceived notions about the world and their ideologies, and probably a lot of these things are defunct and, you know, probably are the reason for why we're in the current state of affairs that we're in. So, you know, in this kind of a situation, you know, you do not want to sort of take these old ideas, okay, that actually, you know, one of the things that they say is good ideas always bubble up to the top, where I don't see any bubbling up over here, all right? These guys have not managed to save us from the situation that we're in right now, okay? So you don't save a spot for Microsoft. It's dead.
So geologists know apocalyptic events better than anyone else. And I think Dr. Moledina's comment about being able to stop any of these is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Earth works. It's pretty hard to stop a hurricane, but we know how to prepare for it. We know how to respond to it. We are survivors. We do this kind of thing every summer, back to Dr. Moledina's comment about doing. We do this every summer, and our IS students do it every summer. And we know the Earth better than anyone else. So I would reiterate my previous comments about our knowledge and our rock hammers and our ability to survive.
I'd also like to address Professor Moledina's rather pejorative, you know, presentation of our respective fields. Again, I would agree with Professor Pollack that he presents a profound, and I mean profound, lack of understanding of how the world works. And he exemplifies for me the phrase that they say about economics as being the dismal science. And what I would remove from that is the part science. What we see through anthropology, and again to address the issue, you know, how none of us have helped, it's because in many cases the world doesn't listen, and it's not the first time. Anybody ever heard of Galileo? Yeah? He kind of had things right, but he was denounced in his time. These kinds of things have happened repeatedly. Humans think in rational ways, but the things that they actually say, they go through a rational process. But if they begin with a false premise, then the ultimate end is improper. It's not a rational decision that's made. What we need is the anthropological lens, something that reflects back on ourselves so that we come to understand who and what we are and how we've been in order to be able to produce a new and productive society.
So I'd like to go back to this question of why are we worth saving, and, you know, what have we lost and what do we want to keep on the boat? We can recover a lot of our scientific knowledge over time, but if we lose what makes us human and our knowledge of human history, then we've lost something we can't replace. And so I would argue that we need to have that kind of memory, that institutional memory of what we've done, what we've created. It will give us hope, and it will give us an awareness of all that's happened before. And I would like to also reiterate this importance of interdisciplinarity and the fact that you get a lot of bang for your buck with art history. And I'm going to isolate one example because it hasn't come up, and I think I'm blatantly pandering here, but I think it will appeal to a good segment of the audience. And that is the fact that we pull very strongly from women and gender studies, and we look very closely at the ways in which power structures are naturalized. And if you think that the only thing that matters is propagating the species, That does not work so well for women. So in terms of thinking about where we are as women in our society today, it's good to have someone who remembers that, someone who will point out that there is a reason that we've evolved in the way that we have, and that it's important not just to say, mandate that all women carry 10 babies because we need to propagate the species. There are philosophical questions that need to be addressed. I would end by saying that I've watched every single episode of Battlestar Galactica like 5 times, and so I think basically any scenario that happens on a boat happened in Battlestar Galactica. Everything that's happened before will happen again, and I know what that is.
Just for the record, we're against overpopulation too, always have been. So, you've heard a lot tonight about technical skills. Who has the technical skills, or the knowledge, or the information to get us through? But fundamentally, surviving this lifeboat crisis is not a question of technical skills, knowledge, or information. It's a question of paradigms. It's a question of worldviews. It's a question of inner integrity. Who do you want on that boat? Fundamentally, you want someone who believes in the future, someone who's positive about the future, even though you're mired in a world of great negativity. And who better than environmental studies people? That's how we spend our lives. We're here mired in a world of pollution, overflowing landfills. Who looks to a future where we reduce our landfills, turn our trash into energy, or stop creating trash in the first place? Environmental studies. We live in a world in which we have this great threat, this menace of climate change constantly confronting us. Who lives in a world in which we look forward to a future where climate change is turned back, where we sequester carbon and go to a fossil fuel-free future? Environmental studies. So just as the lifeboat itself is moving forward and always looking in a positive forward direction, so is environmental studies.
Let me ask you a question. Who here has ever done any carpentry? Who here has ever done any gardening, yard work, growing food? Okay. Who here, and this is okay for our purposes, who here has ever hunted? Okay, see? Who here has any basic first aid or life-saving training? There, see? Okay. You don't need an extra person for the single set of skills you set. We have among us the skills we need for survival. What we need is the guidance that will enable us to create and build a better society than the one we have now. That's why you need religious studies.
Case, we're going to not do that. Exit show, please. You. So has everyone got... Oh. All right. Oh. Oh. Professor Mariola, let's go. Okay. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, that's still the winner. All right, well, thank you for coming. And, yeah, thank you for coming.